Welcome to Tell Me Exactly, an emergency communications podcast. I'm your host, Meridith Jensen, and today we're telling you exactly what the relevant EMS industry standards are and why they matter in emergency communications. On Tell Me Exactly, I invite experts from Priority Dispatch and the International Academies of Emergency Dispatch to talk about all things related to emergency communication centers. Today I'm joined by Brett Patterson and Darren Judd. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely, thanks for coming. All right, so let me tell the listeners a little bit about each one of you. So Brett is the chair of the Medical Council of Standards at the International Academy of Emergency Dispatch. Darren is an MTPS protocol expert at Priority Dispatch. All of us included are longtime EMS and dispatch veterans. So Brett, let's start with you. Tell me exactly what we mean when we talk about EMS industry standards.
Well, I think we probably should start by just talking about what industry standards are.
Absolutely.
And the industry standards are the standard of care or practice, or depending on whatever subject you're talking about, as defined by experts within that particular genre or profession or whatever it is you're talking about. I like to cook. If I'm going to be designing a recipe or cooking something, I reach out to or I research chefs, industry standards for culinary arts. If we're talking about medicine, the first person you think about are physicians or researchers in particular that research clinical standards. So emergency dispatch, at least when I started back in 1987, there weren't a lot of standards for emergency dispatch. What we did have was some clinical standards, but there weren't even a lot of standards for emergency medical care because there were so few specialty physicians in emergency medicine. It sounds kind of funny to say now, but in 1981, that's the way it was.
Wow.
You had some ER docs, but they weren't very involved with EMS, except part-time writing protocols.
Yeah, so how far we've come from there, right? That's amazing.
It's huge. In 1987, there were about 5 full-time medical directors in the whole country. I was fortunate enough to work for one of those, and he wrote a letter to Dr. Clausen recommending that I become an instructor. At that time, that was required, and Dr. Clausen did an interview, and I became an instructor, and it literally changed my life. I went from EMS to communications. But I think the relevant thing regarding standards at that time was we were gaining more and more physicians that had an interest in EMS, in particular, becoming medical directors. And then as the academy evolved, which in itself is an industry standard setting organization, the physician groups or medical directors got more and more involved in communications, to the point where some of those organizations, they do organize, emergency medical service physicians organize, they started writing standards for dispatch. And they reached out to organizations like the Academy to define those standards. I think it's important to know, I think most people know that our standard of care remotely or non-visually is different than field care.
Absolutely. You can't touch anything, you can't see anything. Yeah, you're going in blindfolded and with your hands behind your back. So you have to have a whole different set of rules.
Right. So Dr. Clausen was really the beginning of all of that. And as these medical directors became cognizant of the fact that the dispatchers are really the first responders, and they're making a difference in their patients' care, their patients, it's in their community, they became organized with regard to dispatch. Now, the 2 primary groups out there for emergency physicians is the ASAP for the American College of Emergency Physicians, and NAEMSP, the National Association of Emergency Medical Services Physicians. And those 2 groups have conferences, they get together. If I had to boil it down, there's really 2 groups of them. There's the senior ones that do the teaching and the leading, and then there are all the newbies out of college that decide they want to get into emergency medical services, and they're there to learn. And there's actually courses now at those conferences that are dispatch specific, not only to medical directors and medical control EMS physicians, but with regard to dispatch.
That's awesome. Come full circle then, evolution there, yeah. Okay. And what about any of the other industry standards? You talked about ASAP and NAEMSP,
Right.
which you referred to as what?
National Association of EMS Physicians.
Okay. That sounds like a mouthful to say,
It
right?
really is.
We love our acronyms in the public safety world,
Yeah.
don't we? Right? And NEMSO was another one that you talked about. I also understand that there's one with the Highway Transportation Administration that might come into play.
Well, very early on in EMS, and I'm going back quite some time now. I became a paramedic in 1981 and EMT in 1980, and our textbook was put out by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration.
Okay.
And they're still very involved, and they set standards primarily because they have a handle on statistics. We learn a lot from them about, say, traffic accidents or trauma. The reason that a patient being ejected from a vehicle in protocol, the reason that that's delta level is because of the high mortality from that. We learned that from NHTSA. So we look to organizations like that set standards. It may not line up exactly with EMS or exactly with communications, but there's information we can take from them.
Yeah.
And then there's another organization called the American Society for Testing and Materials, and they set standards. That's what they do. If you want to find out the standard for the thickness of a piece of PVC pipe, you can find that in ASTM.
Okay.
But you can also find QA standards or curriculum standards or protocol standards for emergency dispatch.
Excellent.
They reach out to standard setting organizations, they get the information, they organize it, and then list it so people can reference it over the internet or whatever means, and then try to duplicate or meet or exceed those standards.
And how long in the history of those standards bodies did it take to get an element to include dispatch and 911?
It was a really hard-fought battle. I've been involved in most all of it. Incredibly frustrating when you're literally taking calls, you're saving lives, and then people are saying there's no evidence that this works.
Right.
And there's no evidence to say that we need pre-arrival instructions, or giving pre-arrival instructions are litigious because we're going to do something and somebody's going to die and they're going to sue us. And unfortunately, what it took was quite a few cases of bad outcomes because people didn't get pre-arrival instruction.
Yeah.
And pre-arrival is just one facet of it. The other facet, I think, and what really ultimately got Dr. Clausen started wasn't pre-arrival instructions, it was ambulance triage.
Right.
And as that has evolved, getting people to slow down, ask a few questions, think. We know if it's an emergency right up front, let's make responsible decisions about who goes and how they go.
Right. He talked to us about, on a previous episode, about it's time we started doing it the right way instead of just fast.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly. That's a famous quote. I can't remember the lady's
Bradshaw.
name. Yeah,
Yeah.
no.
I thought that was
her?
the
Yeah, okay.
Bradshaw law.
Yeah.
I might be remembering that wrong.
Well,
But
it may be. It may be.
Yeah.
But it makes a very, very important point that we slow down and make good decisions so we don't put people in danger responding to calls. And I think more recently, the other real motivator for triage protocols and for standards and interrogation of callers is a lack of resources. We see many communities, even more so outside the United States, that simply run out of resource, and they have to prioritize to be able to get resources to the patients who really need that. And more often refer some patients to non-ambulance clinicians that can help them over the phone or get them referred to someplace other than the overcrowded emergency department.
right. We've seen a huge evolution of that over the years too, haven't we? Just based on need. Absolutely.
And it's growing from one country to the next, one community to the next. I don't think you'd be hard-pressed to find any community in the United States who says we have unlimited resources. There are wealthy communities who don't worry much about it, and they send everything to every call, but that's changing.
Yeah. I want to go back to something that you mentioned just a little bit, which is the quality assurance element, right? And of course, in all of our courses that we teach the importance of quality assurance and the fact that the standards are at the core of that, right? If you don't have standards, then how are you measuring whether the tools and resources that you're using are effective, right? And so talk to me a little bit about some of these entities that you've spoken of. What elements have they incorporated for quality assurance with 911 and EMS.
Well, the important thing for me anyway about quality assurance, and this may be just a function of what I do for a living in helping to build protocol and evolve protocol, is we need research and we need evidence and we need examples, if you will, in order to evolve protocol. And if the EMD or EPD or EFD is not following protocol, what we're measuring then, it's ultimately not the protocol. It's the actions of that individual. So compliance to protocol is important so that we make sound decisions about protocol evolution. And we take input from users, input from calls, which is really, really important, and we actually listen to calls to be able to evolve protocol, and then put that together with industry standards, clinical standards. A good example would be resuscitation standards. There are organizations like the International Liaison on Resuscitation that look at all of the research in EMS and other clinical research, and hopefully more and more dispatch research, which we're now seeing, we never saw in the past. And then they evolve those clinical standards and we incorporate that into protocol. But without following the protocol, none of it really helps us.
Mm-hmm. So Darren, I want to talk to you a little bit about NINA, because one of the things that I find interesting, that I often have conversations with people that are not in our industry that, ask me, what do I do for a living? And I try to explain it. One of the things that I find interesting is that a lot of people are aware of the fact that, lots of other industries have standards for training and certification, and dispatch, is different in that area. So I'm sure you can talk to us a little bit about NINA and where they come into play with that.
So yeah, NINA is the actual National Emergency Number Association group. And they do have standards and they do have all these training. But the way they do it is unique, because what they do is they have groups of individuals that are actual users, that are the ones that are creating their standards and their guidelines and everything like that. For example, they have a standard out there for call taking. They want 90% of the calls answered within 15 seconds and 95% of the calls answered within 20 seconds, which is huge for a lot of busy centers and a lot of the centers, right? To get those calls answered in that timely fashion. They also currently have a group working together to figure out how is it going to be best to interact with 988 between the 911 centers and the 988, how do we interact with those mental health facilities?
For mental health, yeah.
For mental health. And not just the 988, they might have a private mental health agency that they're working with. But how do they interact with those? That's some of the things that they're working with. A lot of the dispatchers, they get what's known as the Emergency Number Professional certification.
ENP.
Yeah. And that is, I don't want to say rigorous, but it is time consuming and it can be a challenge and it can be very difficult to obtain sometimes for that certification.
Absolutely. I'm going through the process of studying for my ENP certification right now, and I can tell you it's a beast.
Yeah.
It is not for everyone. So, that's definitely a set of prestigious 3 little letters that go at the end of your name. So it's hard fought and won. So kudos to everybody out there that achieves it.
Right. So it's very, I think, my opinion is it's very unique in the fact that it is the users and the subscribers and that are developing the standards for the NINA group.
So talking about NINA, Darren, I know that NINA also kind of gets into the space a little bit of supporting agencies at the state level when they're seeking to be recognized as first responders. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, they will. They have written different things to help with legislation within the different states, and they will help support that 100%.
Right, because that all ties into that certification, training requirements, the ENP,
Right.
all things that make that dispatcher a better person responding to those calls on the phone.
Correct, and that's part of the thing is, and it's them helping each other become a better dispatcher.
Excellent.
With their certifications.
So Brett, what else could you tell us about NINA and what they're doing with the standards?
Well, they're a very large organization that has a membership made up of dispatchers, whether that be police, fire, or medical. And as such, they're recognized as a industry standard-setting organization for 911. So politicians listen to them. So they essentially lobby for the 911 community. From what I understand about NENA, and I've been involved with them to a limited extent, they're a little different from the academy in that they focus on processes and technology. So they help evolve the technologies that help us do our job. They're not as clinical oriented or protocol oriented when it comes to care of patients or fire scenes or police scenes or that sort of thing. They help us with the processes that help us do our jobs, and they lobby to evolve those processes. Next generation 911, that finding a patient when they don't have an address, lobbying politicians to encourage cell phone carriers to adopt the technology that will help us accomplish those goals. And for that, speaking from the academy, we're very grateful to NENA for what they do.
Excellent. Yeah, all the little widgets and gadgets and technology pieces that it takes for someone that needs help and dials those 3 numbers on their cell phone for that call to get from that person to the responders that need it, and then getting the wheels going on the ground, right? So, excellent. All right, so we've talked about all of the different standards bodies that are in place. Now let's talk a little bit about why this should be important to leadership at any comm center.
Well, I think if you're leading a comm center, you should be very aware of what those standards are, and the standards have simply evolved. It wasn't that long ago, and unfortunately it still happens in some places, where the communications center, the focus in the communications center is all about getting an address to responders and going to the call. There's not much in there about triage, not much in there about pre-arrival instructions. And as that evolves, that voice needs to be heard so that the communications center leadership knows they need to invest in that. For a long time, the cost was the excuse that we got that people didn't want to implement protocols. Dr. Clausen is famous for saying, putting your EMDs through the certification course is cheaper than the chair they're sitting in. And that's exactly right.
Yeah.
So lobbying for the importance of training dispatchers, the importance of certification, the importance of QA, the importance of accreditation, industry leaders need to be aware of that so that they can fund it and evolve it as they should.
Doesn't it also help with liability too?
Well, I think there's no question about that. There's no question
It protects that call taker. It helps protect them from any adverse events or anything.
Not just the call taker, but the agency and the community as a whole, right? We live in such a litigious society, as you mentioned earlier, Brett, and so anything that we can do to avoid that liability is...
And you're right, the plaintiff's attorney wants the agency and the governmental body. They don't want the dispatcher.
They want the person with the biggest checkbook,
Yeah,
right?
exactly,
The deepest
sure,
pockets,
sure.
Absolutely. Okay, and so how do these standards that are in place impact the day-to-day operations in a comm center?
I would think they should enhance the day-to-day operations in the comm center. It should make the dispatcher's life easier because they have their standards. They know what's expected of them. They know how to do things and the right procedures to do them versus just making it up on the fly.
And then a question for either one of you. Does every agency really need to be cognizant of all of these standards? Or are there ones that they really should be zoned in on to start? If they're just getting started at looking at something that is going to help them with meeting these standards, which ones should they focus on first?
Well, you're going to find a lot of redundancy in
Yeah.
the standards. The
suspected.
ASTM standards about training and certification and QA mirror those that come from other organizations.
Sure.
The physician groups tend to lean towards the clinical standards rather than training, but NAEMSP has an excellent position paper on emergency medical dispatching that has evolved over the years and now covers most all of the bases. So there's a lot of redundancy there. So,
Okay.
I mean, the quick answer to your question is I think they need to look at them all,
Of
everyone
course.
that's available. And it's not too big to look at all of them. In talking about NAEMSP and ACEP, they look to industry experts to develop their positions. For a long time, Dr. Clausen was very active in NAEMSP. Some of the first personal communication I had with him was at NAEMSP annual meeting. And as medical directors got more and more involved, you can ask virtually any of them today about the Academy, and they'll know who you're talking about. The Academy is a very big organization. It's made up of industry experts, and I'll talk about the medical protocol specifically. Physicians from all around the world that are medical directors in EMS organizations, and they sit on the Standards Council and give us input about what the best clinical practice is. And the unique thing about these folks that work with the Academy is they also have an expertise in dispatch. So when they give us clinical opinions, it's dispatch related, and that's extremely important. It's a real challenge looking at a clinical guideline in a hospital and trying to convert that into triage or pre-arrival instructions in a non-visual environment. But when you have industry experts, which is what the Academy's made up of, you develop dispatch-specific standards, and there is no larger industry standard-setting organization in dispatch than the Academy. It's just way beyond anything else that's out there.
Sort of a square peg in a round hole kind of thing, right? We cannot apply the same standards to patient care when you are in a clinical setting where you can touch them and see them and assess them and access them than we do in dispatch, where none of that is possible. So,
Yeah, you can't do it blindly.
Yeah.
You can look at it and with really good thought, then alter that guideline to be dispatch specific and make it every bit as valuable as it is in the clinical setting.
yeah. And one of the things that I like that I'm hearing about the discussions that we're having today is that none of these standards are set in stone. Right? It sounds like some of them have come a long way over the years, right? And just really evolved with learning new science, learning new best practices. One of the things that comes to mind to me when I think about that is the tourniquet protocol, right? Talk a little bit about how that changed over the years.
Well, a lot of things have changed in clinical medicine and in EMS, and we learned a lot from that. We used to put what are called mask trousers on patients and to squeeze their legs and push blood up into their head. Makes perfect sense when you think about it, but the clinical trials, that was an out-of-hospital practice, and we did it because we thought that it worked at that time. But with time and research, that standard evolved to no longer be true, and the same thing happened with tourniquets.
Right.
We learned that tourniquets, especially through the information that we garnered clinically from war engagements and wounds suffered in war, horrific wounds to limbs, that tourniquets are very, very valuable, so that was incorporated into protocol. I just finished my presentation for our spring update to the MPDS, and there are a lot of changes that are based on clinical evolution, namely in obstetrics. So there's some cool stuff coming out in obstetrics, things that we thought were, I don't want to say right all along, because they were right at the time,
Right.
but things that we have discovered over time that could be changed or would better serve our patients.
Yeah, now that we know better, we can do better. That's how it should always be.
Yeah, the trick is to stay informed of those international guidelines, talk to people who develop them, follow the research, and then look at those things through a DLS lens and adapt that to protocol.
But even with doing that, it takes a lot of work from the Academy side of it, the house, if I'm not mistaken, because it's not just we're going to do tourniquets, we've got to figure out how we're going to apply those tourniquets, how they're going to be used in best practice, what situations to use them and all of that, correct?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you got to test these things. And they test it typically in the office with non-clinicians, and they tell them what to do, and from another room, and see how they react. Everything from pulling a patient off a bed to applying a tourniquet to applying a tourniquet when there's no manufactured tourniquet available, fashioning one, and that research results then in protocol change.
Absolutely. Well, gentlemen, I can't thank you enough for spending some time today to tell me exactly how these industry standards are going to impact emergency communication centers and a little bit more about the history behind them. So thanks again for joining me. I would love to have you come back and share more of your wealth of knowledge and experience with us. What do you think?
Well, I'd love to, Meredith. I think what you've done today is help to evolve industry standards just by making emergency dispatchers more aware of how important these standards are. Nobody wants to do the job wrong. They want to know how to do it right. Nobody comes to work saying, I want to hurt patients. So they look to those standards to provide better care for patients. And podcasts like this help make that happen.
Thank you. I hope so. That's our goal. We're having a lot of fun doing it, and we're super excited to just see what else we can get into. Darren, thanks again for your time today and your expertise as well.
Hey, it's my pleasure anytime.